Welcome to Warrior Stories. My name is Susanna Clark Taylor. Today is January 4th, 2023, and my guest today is Meghan Ashburn from Virginia. Hi, Meghan.
Hi, Susanna. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I always like to say how I know my guests. And Meghan, you and I are both 2022 graduates of the Partners in Policy Making program put on by the Virginia Board for People with Disabilities. I felt like that was such an impactful experience. And one of the most impactful parts for me was just getting to know all of the other advocates. And you and I had the chance to kind of tackle an issue together because we chose a similar advocacy topic to train around, and we were trying to get parents as paid providers for their own children with disabilities passed through the General Assembly, and we were successful.
You
It
did it.
it was amazing, and when I jumped into that experience, to be honest, I didn't think it would work out the way that it did. I just thought, okay, let's advocate around this, let's train and figure out how you go about legislative policy change. And lo and behold, we were able to grab the attention of people that could actually make a difference. And a group of us, as part of Partners in Policymaking, were able to get that legislation passed. That was amazing.
It was amazing. And I had no idea either. I mean, I just thought it was me because, we're so isolated in what we were doing, especially during COVID. And, I was benefiting from this immensely. Our family was benefiting from being paid as providers. And I mean, obviously, like when we're not talking with one another and we're not together, we don't share these things. And Pip gave us that opportunity. And once, I shared it, and then I don't know who shared it first, but like all of us shared it. And it was just so impactful saying, oh my gosh, this is a thing that needs to
Realizing,
happen.
exactly, realizing, I'm not the only one. And then you actually were the one that reached out to a bunch of us, and because you paid attention and you took notes as we were talking as part of the big group, because of course there were lots of different advocacy topics that people chose. And you were the one that reached out to the rest of us and said, hey, let's collaborate. And I feel like that's where that eventual policy change grew out of. So that was amazing. So I'm so glad that you did that.
Yes. Yes. We did it. We did the thing.
I know we did have to do the thing. So yeah, it's amazing. So, Meghan, why don't we start out and have you tell us a little bit about yourself and about your professional background before we jump into the rest of our conversation?
Sure. So I am Meghan Ashburn and I live in Virginia Beach, Virginia. And I started out as a elementary school teacher out in Southampton County in real Virginia. It's not Nova or it's not the Norfolk area. It's real Virginia. So yeah, I taught elementary school, fourth and fifth grade inclusion settings for 6 years, I think. And then I had my twins and I stopped working. And then once they got their autism diagnosis, I just started learning. And so ever since then, I've just been doing a lot of listening, learning, unlearning, training, learning about advocacy, and just sharing what I've learned. So my blog, notanautismmom.com, is just a website for people to go to find resources, educators, parents. I mean, anybody who wants to learn about autism. It's more like a landing site to find more resources,
Right.
basically.
Right. I love that. I love that just as a resource. So most parents of children with disabilities have a line of demarcation, kind of a before and after you knew that you would be part of this community. I'm hoping that you are willing to tell us about the day you knew your life would not be what you expected it to be. And if it's not like one singular day, maybe the series of events that led to the point where you realized the life I thought I was going to lead and the life that I thought my children were going to lead is not the life that we are going to lead.
Yeah, so I guess 9 years ago, 10 years ago, I was working as a teacher, like I said, and I became pregnant with twins and it was so exciting. And
You have older children too, right?
yes, at the time we had three children living with us. We have a blended family, so sometimes we have a fluctuation of the number of kids that we have in the house. But at that time, I had three in the house with us, with my husband. And I went into labor early. And I didn't think it was that early because when you have twins,
Mhm.
uh, they're going to take them at 37 weeks anyway. So I was only really like, do the math, 3 weeks earlier from that. So I felt like, they were good and
Yeah.
healthy, right, ready to come. And when I went into labor, they took them via C-section. And when we got into the NICU, they were like, well, they're not coming home for a long time.
Wow.
Like, expect them to stay here in the NICU an hour away from our house because we were living in Southampton County at the time, and we had to come to Norfolk for like the fancy stuff and like the all of the good stuff for twins, high risk pregnancies and things. So the twins had to stay in Norfolk for 6 weeks, and during that time, I mean, I was back and forth every single day from the NICU to home because I mean, my older kids, they needed me,
Yeah.
right? Like, that's a huge change.
Yep.
Not saying anything against my husband because he, like, he held the fort down, but it's different.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So during, I think it wasn't a moment, but it was just during that time, I realized that there's no way I can do this. My children were not healthy.
Right.
There were several occasions where the doctors were like, we're just going to have to wait and see because we don't know what's happening. He was getting nutrition through a pick line for like weeks at a time, and it was intense.
Right.
So I think it was during that time when I just realized, like, I can't even go back to work. Like, what am I can't work anymore. They're not healthy,
Right.
and once they got home from the NICU, one of my kids went back into the PICU because of RSV.
Oh my goodness.
So that was another month of going back and forth. And then I had infant twins on two sides. So that entire time, I think, was when I realized that what I had planned was no longer going to happen.
That it's not just that you got to get through this difficult couple of weeks and then life can go on the way you expected. It really was never going to return to anything that you expected it to be.
No.
Yeah.
Because when you think about it, like, I was teaching,
Mhm.
and it's not a terrible paycheck, but it's not a great paycheck either, right? I mean, nobody does that for the money. And having twins who needed extra care, and what would daycare look like for that, and how much would that be? It's just a balancing act, and having to manage 5 children.
Exactly. And it's not just the healthcare concerns for your newborns or taking care of your older kids and making sure their needs are met. You have your own needs, like the emotional impact on
Geez,
you
that was
and
like out the window.
right,
That was out the window a long time ago.
right.
Yeah,
But it doesn't mean just because we can't prioritize it, when we're in the midst of the trauma that we go through as parents of special needs children, even if you're not able to prioritize and think about your own mental health, it doesn't mean you're not being impacted by the effects of your mental health. So,
absolutely. I mean, during that time, I didn't even go to my follow-up appointment for my C-section.
wow.
I mean, I was in a primary location, a secondary location, and then I would have to go to a tertiary location just to get seen. And
I
who has time
see.
for that, right? Like, I'm going back and forth every single day, and then you want me to stop here?
Right,
No.
right.
Yeah.
Thank goodness you were okay, because what if, what if you hadn't been? Yeah.
Yeah, and I've written about that as well. A lot of my earlier writing was, it had to do with autism, and it had to do with prematurity, and it had to do with, moms in the NICU, and how we are still patients, but we're not. We don't have any of the protections or the care of a patient, but we are patients, right? We are recovering. We are doing way more than we should be doing at that time. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a very real trauma that parents go through, and I don't think it's talked about enough. It's heavy.
It is heavy, and I don't usually talk about this. So thank you, Susanna, for being my counselor today.
It's something that I feel the weight of. Even today, my daughter's very healthy now, but I can still recognize the consequences of the things that I went through when she was younger. getting used
When
to.
COVID happened, I mean, I was very triggered by just the way the illness presented because of the RSV that my kids had. It was almost like RSV for old people, and like seeing how it was manifesting, and like now that there are so many kids getting RSV now, it triggers me every time I see, like, a baby in the hospital on those ventilators, and it is very triggering.
Yeah, the trauma is real and it lasts a long time for sure. And if you haven't been through it, you don't know. You just don't know what that's like. So, well, no, I totally relate. Okay, so there's 1,000 things I could ask you about in regard to your twins and their autism and things that they've gone through. But I picked a few, so we're just gonna jump around a little bit. So, currently they're how old? 9, 10 years old?
9. Yeah, they're 9. Yes.
And they both have an autism diagnosis. Is that right?
That's right.
But they have different needs. Their needs aren't exactly the same. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So that's unique amongst parents of children with disabilities. I think like you have double. Let me see if I can find the words I'm looking for. Double the mental load as a mother as you're trying to navigate on one side. Some things apply to your other child, but then other things don't apply. I would take it, right?
I honestly, I mean, just, the multiple children, the multiple issues, like the multiple loads, but having identical twins
Mm-hmm.
with autism diagnosis and them being so different,
Mm-hmm.
it has really given me a lot of perspective. And it has helped me in my own learning because I get to see, how people will say, oh, the different ends of the spectrum and all of this, but it's really not like that. It's just they each have these individual needs, and they have different challenges, and also different personalities, and different strengths and interests. So it has actually been helpful for my learning. I think once I started unlearning what the doctors told me,
Sure.
because before, in the very beginning, one of my kids was misdiagnosed because he was too social to be autistic, right? Like he smiles at you, and
Right.
and so the doctors were like, no, you can't be autistic. So once I got over that initial like confusion of like what was going on, and I found the autistic community online, which was like a lifesaver for me. Then I started really diving into like different support needs, and different co-occurring conditions, and it was actually kind of helpful to have two of them being so different.
That's a unique perspective because my daughter has her primary diagnosis is charge syndrome, and it's rare enough. I don't personally know other children with charge syndrome. I'm part of a Facebook group, and I have these community connections, but everybody lives far away. I don't personally know anybody else with charge syndrome. And so my perspective of charge syndrome is my experience with my daughter. And the same saying applies to children with charge syndrome as autism. When you've met a child with autism, you've met a child with autism, just one. But you have that interesting experience where you have two children with autism. And
And
so
that phrase rings so true.
right. But it allows you to have a broader perspective and a broader experience in regard to autism, right?
Yeah,
Do both of them use AAC devices or just one?
that's a great question. No, only one of them. So both of them were their language they didn't start talking till 3.5. So no words at all until then. And then one of them started talking a little bit, and his language just progressed very quickly. I mean, it is not the typical progression, but it's still very,
He has language.
yeah, he has language,
Audible
he can
language.
talk, very conversational now. And then my other one, he never started talking, and he has apraxia, total body apraxia, dyspraxia. And so he uses AAC.
Okay, so I'm going to have you define a couple of things for those who are watching this and may not know what things mean. So I'm going to have you explain what AAC means, what it is, and then also explain what apraxia is.
Great. Those are great questions. And this is kind of the work that I do on a daily basis, is talk about AAC and talk about different communication options and apraxia and dyspraxia, because the first thing I want to say is when you go to the doctor's office and get an autism diagnosis for your kid, I often find that that kid is now placed in like the autism trash can. And what I mean by that is there are so many different co-occurring conditions, so many different support needs that should be placed in that child's chart, or should be, the parents should be learning about, the teacher should be learning about. But once you get the autism diagnosis, the doctors are like, oh, well, autism explains that. So the parents are not getting that education about apraxia. So apraxia and dyspraxia are, they're used interchangeably, and they kind of mean the same thing. Apraxia is the inability to tell your body what you want it to do. Like, it's called the brain body disconnect. So for instance, a child may want to stop running and can't because its body is not listening to it. Or a child may want to, let's see, say a word and a screen comes out. Or a child may want to point to one thing and points to something else. So it's a brain body disconnect, and it's important to learn about that, right? And dyspraxia just means some loss of that control.
Gotcha.
And so it's used interchangeably in the speech and in the SLP world. They use the apraxia of speech diagnosis. In the medical DSM, they use dyspraxia as a diagnosis, but they're used interchangeably, and it can fluctuate all the time depending on the setting. So like at home, for instance, your kid might be able to do all of these things because it's familiar and they have that muscle memory and they've been building that up and there's no pressure. But then when they get to the grocery store, they're not able to do those things.
Right. So somebody's ability might be a lot higher than they first give others the impression that it is. And when it comes to education, that can translate into educators assuming a child has less ability than they actually do.
Absolutely. And just to put it in terms of like going to school, like let's just say preschool, right? And your autistic kid is in preschool, is non-speaking, and they're doing like a matching or an identifying shapes thing. And your kid, they're like, you know, where is the circle? And your kid points to the triangle. Doesn't necessarily mean that they don't know what a circle is, right? But they can't perform the way you want them to perform, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So that brings in like presuming competence, which doesn't necessarily mean that the kid knows everything, right? But it's presuming that the kid has the capacity to learn, presuming that they will sort it out in their own time, and to make sure that you're not limiting access to further knowledge. Because as a teacher, there's like a standard protocol. It's instruction, guided practice, independent practice, or homework or whatever, and then you assess. And then once you give that assessment, depending on what the results are, you either remediate or you go on to the next thing. And so what happens so many times is that autistic kids, especially non-speakers, especially those with apraxia, they just go back in the cycle and they're never moved on to more learning. And if they're never exposed to more learning, exposed to those inclusive environments, exposed to just more, then they certainly won't grow or learn as fast.
So it sounds like they get on kind of a hamster wheel of education where the benchmarks or the qualifiers that the educator might say, if they reach this benchmark, it tells us that they've learned what they need to, and then we'll move them on. But if they don't reach that benchmark, they just kind of keep getting circulated back.
Right.
But the problem is those benchmarks perhaps don't accurately identify whether or not they're learning. And I loved what you said about presumed competence. That's been a huge thing with my daughter. And I'll just use, bathrooming as an example, because she's total care and she needs help with that. And in the beginning, well, I'm going to ask you in a minute to explain AAC devices, but she would indicate, or she might push a button that is supposed to indicate that she needs to use the bathroom. And they didn't know whether or not she meant it or not. but they presumed competence. They presumed that she knew how to accurately communicate. So then they would take her to the bathroom, even if she didn't need to go. And over time, she learned, oh, if I push that button, that's where I go. So then when she needed to use the bathroom, she could then push the button and then
That's right.
take it. And she's a lot more accurate now than she used to be. I do think that it's not entirely accurate. Like she's still learning, you know. But that doesn't matter. They are presuming competence, and because they have done that in regard to this issue, there are other things we're still working on. But in regard to bathrooming, she she knows how to get herself to the bathroom at school,
That's
right?
awesome.
So that applies to anything that a child is trying to learn. And that's why when educators presume competence, it's kind, I don't know if you would say it's a backwards way of teaching, but it's kind of like it's a way to teach a child that kind of boosts them towards success, like assuming that they know things rather than waiting for them to indicate that they know them. And it helps them to get off of that hamster wheel so they can be exposed to more things, right?
Well, and it's taking a leap of faith a lot of times, right? Because we're such a data driven education system now, which right or wrong, whatever, but it's all about data. So if you don't have the data to support moving on, then
Mhm.
they don't move on. And so this is more like a leap of faith in saying it's not that we think that the kid knows everything,
Right.
right? We're still going to use all of our tools in our toolbox. We're still going to support that child, but it's about access,
Right.
right? We're not going to withhold access from more learning opportunities, literacy instruction. We're not going to withhold access to that because what is definitely a fact is that if we don't teach them more, they will learn a lot less,
Right.
right? So there is no risk in teaching them, but there's a huge risk if you're not sure if they know it, but if you're wrong, right? And if you think that they don't know it and they do, that's a risk,
Yep.
right? Like
It
there
has
is
come back.
serious consequences in that. There's
Yep.
a book. I'm all about books. Ito and Autism Land by Ito Kedar. He talks about this because he's an AAC user
Mhm.
and talks about that those early years of being just having to read these Dick and Jane books because they didn't know if he understood or not. So they withheld access. And that was a problem. I
Right.
mean, it was damaging.
Right. Right. It prevents a child from learning as much as they could be learning.
Absolutely.
And like you said, it's not going to hurt them to expose them to
There's no
more
risk.
information. There's no risk, but there is a huge risk not teaching them as much as you ought to be teaching
Right.
them because yeah, yeah, there's a huge risk. So okay, so we took a break for a minute so you could go grab an AAC device. So I'm hoping that you'll explain what they are and some of the advocacy work that you've had to do around AAC devices.
Yeah, sure. So AAC stands for Augmentative Alternative Communication. So it's basically any type of communication that's not using speech to communicate. So it could be anything from like gesturing. A lot of kids might use your hand to get something and to like indicate what they want. It could be gesturing. It could be hand gestures, stomping on the ground. That's kind of AAC because you know what they're talking about. It could be sign language. It could also be like a core board like this. A lot of preschools have these where it
Right.
has pictures and the words. Another low tech option would be just like these kind of pictures and words. It's just uh, visuals and visual schedules,
Mhm.
different things like that. That's all AAC. And then there's high tech AAC, which is usually an app on a tablet or an iPad. And
Mhm.
this is one I'll just show you. This is my son's. Uh, this is actually my older son's iPad, but he also has the AAC up there. So uh, this is what it looks like, and it has pictures and words on it. You can see that it has lots of words. And then over here, you'll see on this side, it has folders of different
Right.
people and time and food. And then it also has a keyboard.
Okay.
And
So if they're able to spell, they can spell things out. That if they don't, if the pictures aren't available, they can actually spell things out.
absolutely. And this was really a game changer in our family. We did not learn about AAC until my son was 4, which
Mm,
is really too old to be
right.
learning about that, right? Because we were followed since the NICU. My kids were followed by the developmental pediatricians in the area,
Mhm.
and we never heard about it, right? They're non-speaking. Both of them were non-speaking until 3.5. We
Mm,
had never heard about an AAC device or app.
right.
And it wasn't until I changed doctors and we had SLPs coming into that. We had early intervention. We had all of the things, right? Because they were delayed, and so we had OTs and SLPs coming in ever since they were little,
Right.
and nobody mentioned
So
AAC to
interesting.
us.
Yeah, it makes
So
me cry. But yeah, it's interesting that they didn't. It's too bad.
yeah,
It's really unfortunate that because and that's the thing. And I do sometimes wonder if doctors and therapists and educators assume parents know more than they do. And I feel like I went through that a lot with my daughter, that I would learn about things and people would talk to me about them as though I already knew about them. And in my mind, I thought,
what are you talking about?
what are you talking about? And then one
Can
time
I
I
get some background information on this?
right.
Right.
And for a while I felt stupid, like what it seems like I should know about this, but I don't. So it felt like I was failing somehow until I got to the point where I recognized no, they actually have a responsibility to educate me. There's so much you're coming into this experience with, the burden of it, right? Like just all the medical stuff and the trauma and the bills, and we're not going to know stuff. Like we need to be educated by those professionals about what's available for our children. That's part of our child's education, is informing the parents of what the options are.
Absolutely. I mean, you have to think about it from the twins. They went to preschool since they were 2,
Right.
like a little bit of preschool in the public school system. So they had several teachers. They were in preschool 2 years old, 3 years old, and it wasn't until 4 years old, and it wasn't even the teacher telling me about the AAC, because they didn't have AAC in the
Right.
classroom.
Right.
So AAC in particular, I feel like everybody passes the buck, right? That's why you have middle schoolers that are non-speaking with no AAC device. Their parents have never heard of it. I'm in a lot of parent groups just to kind of keep my ears to the ground, see what's going on. And anytime I hear of like a non-speaking kid, I ask, well, does your kid have AAC device? And they're like, well, what's that?
Right.
Nobody is, I'm not saying nobody, but it's something that is so simple and something that is so beneficial that it should be standard practice.
Do you think it's the money for the technology that's not being,
I
that
mean, there are really several things happening when it comes to high tech AAC. And I mean, I had to go down lots of rabbit holes for this because I couldn't wrap my mind around like what is happening.
yeah,
Because insurance will pay for the tablet, the iPad, and the app, right? But we had to jump through so many hoops. It took us a year to get it approved.
right.
We had to get a rental device. We had to go through like trials for 3 months. Then, if the SLP filled it out correctly and they were going to approve it, then we had to send the rental back to the company after my kid learned how to use it so
Right.
that they could give him his permanent device.
Right.
And I just didn't understand why it was happening. Like, it's a tablet.
Why is it so complicated? Because other students in public education these days are getting Chromebooks, and so
Yeah, exactly.
it
So
should
what
be
is the deal with
funded
this?
right.
And what is happening is that because it's listed under durable medical equipment, that means you'll use it for 5 years, right? You have one thing for like 5 years. The companies that are providing these are able to charge Medicaid $8,000 for a tablet.
Mm.
This is an iPad with an app on it. The
Right.
app at the time, most high-tech AAC apps were bust apps, are around $200, $300, most of them. So what is the hefty price for
Right, but
parents that don't have money and plus an iPad? But it's still under $1,000 to get
it's not.
all of that.
Yeah, it's not $8,000.
Right. And they're charging $8,000. So of course the insurance company is like, well, if we're paying $8,000 for something, they damn well better be damn well better work and be useful for the child. But it is mind blowing and it is enraging to me.
It makes me wonder why it has to be categorized as durable medical equipment rather than being categorized as an educational device, like our other kids who get Chromebooks.
Is it the category that I don't know
Right? Is it
that.
the category that it's falling into that causes it to be so expensive that allows the company to charge insurance so much money? Because that we all know that happens, right? As soon as something is categorized as for the
Like
disability.
a wheelchair and like a bed, a hospital
Exactly.
bed,
It's
those things.
astronomically more expensive than it would if it was just
Criminal, honestly. It is really criminal. And it is because of that categorization that they are allowed to do that. Like, we can't compare it to a Chromebook because insurance is not paying for Chromebooks,
right.
right? So I don't know what you would compare it to.
Yeah.
It's just so many things in the system that it's working against getting access to AAC.
Right.
It's that type of money, that type of systemic issue over here in the medical insurance world. And then it's in the schools. There's still oralism happening in the schools.
Right. And real quick, and I want to talk about that for a minute, but before we move on to that, I just wanted to say that so it sounds to me like because the AAC device, if the school was providing it and it was being categorized simply as an educational device, it belongs to the school and the child does not move on with it. But because this is something your child needs to communicate all of the time, it can't belong to the school. It needs to belong to the child, which means it goes through the durable medical equipment category, which allows insurance to pay for it. But what that means is these medical equipment companies end up charging insurance companies so much money, which means it's so much harder to get it approved because insurance companies don't want to pay for it. And then your child is the one that's being disadvantaged by all these people who are trying to make money off of each other.
And just the lack of education around AAC, the fact that nobody told me about it, the fact that I didn't really know anything about it at all. I thought that a device, this AAC device, was some ethereal thing, right? Something super complicated. It comes with this, like I thought it was a device, right? But it's not. It wasn't until after, like, I think my kid broke his, and I was like, "Oh, this is an iPad. Like, what in the world? Like, this is just an iPad." And it doesn't even have to be a brand new iPad because the AAC apps only take up like at most 2 gigabytes, right? So it doesn't have to be some like fancy iPad. It doesn't have to be brand new. It can be a used iPad. So just the education around it, it is more accessible than we think it is. And so if I could go back in time, I would have said, "Hey mom, can I have this old iPad of yours? It's just sitting on the shelf," or do a fundraiser for an iPad or something like that. And now I do want to say this, and I don't work for this company at all, but there's a brand new app that just came out and it's called Proloquo, not Proloquo to go, but this app right here is called Proloquo and it's only $10 a month.
Right.
And so that takes away that other chunk that you need. So now you need the iPad and now you have a monthly service instead of 2 big chunks of money. Right. And that's huge.
Yeah,
it's huge.
Absolutely. You have found that to be successful for your son?
This app is revolutionary. It's just going to change the game. Honestly, it's going to change the game for AAC. In the next 5 years, I can see AAC becoming so much more normalized and accessible to people. But there's a lot of hurdles to get through. There are just so many hurdles.
So it sounds like parents in general need to be there. There needs to be more of a proactive effort to educate parents about the existence of AACs, what they are, what they do for a child, and then get them into the hands of those children much earlier than 4 years old.
Yeah,
So
early intervention and home. Yeah, like those smaller early head starts, like starting them when they're young, when they're learning language and having it just be part of our toolbox, right?
it's
We use
so
sign language all the time with babies
exactly,
now, right? Because
exactly.
it helps them, it helps all children be able to say what they want to say, even though they can't say it. And that's for all kids.
Right. And it should be introduced at the same time as just regular language is being introduced to typical functioning children, right? Which is from the moment that they're born, and then little by little they hear
Part of
things
it.
and
Yeah.
learn things. So if there's even the possibility, like you said before, it's not going to harm a child with autism or any child that may end up being nonverbal. It's not going to harm them if they're exposed to the technology from the time that they're,
No.
little. So you might as well give them the opportunity to develop language with the devices, and then they'll be so much further ahead than, like, we don't wait until a child walks into preschool, a typical functioning child, to walk into preschool before we start speaking to that child.
No.
So if we know that if we know a child has certain diagnoses where they could potentially end up being nonverbal, we should be introducing these things into their lives from the
Absolutely.
earliest moment possible. And if it ends up not being something that that child benefits from, okay, they're not damaged by the exposure. But if it does end up being something that helps them, the benefit is exponential, right?
Absolutely. And
Right.
it helps the parent as well because, I mean, like I said in the beginning, I didn't know a lot of stuff,
Mhm.
right? Like my kids were diagnosed around 3.5, 4. So all of this was happening at the same time. I had not found the autistic community. I had not found other non-speakers to learn from. I had not read that book, Ito and Autism Land. So at that time, autistic toddlers, a lot of them are very, they've got this sensory thing going on. It's so much happening. We haven't learned each other's triggers. We don't, I'm still carrying on a normal life and like saying, come on, we're going to go to this event. And so I hadn't learned all of these things yet. And I didn't presume competence at that time.
You
I
didn't know
didn't,
to.
I didn't know anything about presuming competence. I didn't know that nobody had told me that he can learn this stuff even if he's not proving that he's learning it, right? Nobody told me any of this stuff. So I didn't presume competence. And once we got that AAC, he picked up on it so quickly, of course, because he's a kid and it's technology.
Mhm.
And I was like, oh, so you do know your letters and oh, your shapes and like all the preschool things that we've been doing for 3 years. And it was a light bulb for me as well to be like, oh,
And
well,
how
let's move on to something else. Like, let's,
how
continue.
unfortunate for you as a mother, and then also your child, that, again, I mean, it's not only does that early intervention need to take place in regard to a child's education, but stop assuming that parents of children with disabilities know what we're doing. Like, if the child needs that education, the parents do too, because we don't know. Like, walking into this world, we don't know what we're doing. We have to stumble around in the dark half the time and figure it
Yeah.
out. It really would be great if, as early intervention is provided for children, and thank goodness that even exists, because that didn't used to be a thing, and it's because of the advocacy of so many people who came before us that that's even a thing for our kids now, right? But
For sure.
I hope for future generations that it's not just that the early intervention services for the child will include education for the parents in a way that I didn't experience when my daughter was little.
And I mean, honestly, like all of this is systemic, right? It's cyclical, it's systemic because the SLPs, a lot of them are not learning about AAC. I mean, it's getting a little bit better over the last couple of years. I've seen it more, a transition to that, but it's kind of like a couple decades ago when they started, using sign language with kids and they would be like, don't use that because it's going to stop them from speaking.
But it
right?
didn't.
But it doesn't, it only helps. But it's the
Exactly.
same kind of oralist, misinformation, misguided ideas about AAC that have resulted in SLPs not learning about AAC and not pushing AAC. So they're not learning about it in college. They can't become SLPs and teach the parents about it in early intervention because they don't know it. They
Right.
don't know anything about it. So it really does it's going to take that grassroots things that I do with I have a co-host who is an AAC user, and we do trainings. We did trainings in we just did a training for the Washington State libraries to get librarians to use AAC. We do trainings in England because they're not getting the training. The professionals are not getting the training in their schooling.
Right.
So it really needs to come from the bottom. It needs
Yeah.
to.
Absolutely. So explain that concept. You've said that word a couple of times, oralist. So explain that. Explain kind of the assumptions, the negative assumptions associated with it, and even some perhaps prejudice that that exists in that space. So explain what you mean when you say oralist.
Well, I'll tell you, I'm not an expert, but I will try to break it down how I understand it. Is just that basically speech is more valuable, is superior to any other type of communication.
The
So,
assumption. So people assume that it is that
right,
it's
it's that,
um,
yeah,
it's better than
right.
other ways of communicating. So those who
So, if
cannot communicate through speech are discriminated against to some degree. Is that what you're saying?
yeah, absolutely. And the push, especially when kids are younger, for speech instead of communication, right? So that's how it manifests. So like you might have an SLP who thinks, oh well, let's try to get him talking. Let's see if he's starting to talk. Let's see how that goes. Let's push. Let's go in that direction and hold off on this AAC device. That's oralist, right? Because no type of communication is better than the other, right? And that it's hard for us to wrap our minds around that because we all kind of we have those biases, right? But all communication begets communication, and that's Tiffany from Nigh Functioning Autism says that all the time. Communication begets communication. So any type of communication that you're using is going to help other communication,
Right.
right? So if you're talking, or if it's going to help this, if you're using this, it might help speech, right? So the idea that if you introduce this, it will slow down speech production it is
It's
so wrong, right? The data is clear on that, but there are still people who believe it.
so anybody who has the ability to develop speech, that ability will not in any way be hampered by either learning low tech AAC like sign language or, with the pictures that you showed or anything else, or high tech AAC, such as an iPad with an app on it. If those that have the ability to develop speech will not be negatively impacted by learning other ways of communication on their way to developing speech. And some children with disabilities do learn how to communicate with speech, like your other son with autism, at 3 or 4 years old. But then I know of some kids of other diagnoses that develop some limited speech even into 10, 12 years old. They start picking up words and are finally able to express them. And so sometimes it's years before oral communication develops, but in no way was that delayed in any way by other kinds of communication, like you said.
And I'll give you an example of that. One of my friends, he's been on in the book club with us, Danny Whitty, and he is at Danny with Words on all the social medias. And we interviewed him because he's around my age, like he's in his upper 30s or something like that. But he was non-speaking for his whole entire life. No AAC, no access to anything. Like he was not able to communicate at all, right? At all until he was in his 30s. And then he started spelling.
Okay.
With Spelling to Communicate, Elizabeth Bossler and stuff. So he started spelling And as it turns out, he's like smarter than all of us, of course, right? He he puts me to shame when we're talking about writing, but what happened was he really wanted to start, training his mouth to to say the things that he wanted to say. And so what happened is when he started spelling and typing, he started saying the words, and he was in his 30s. And so now he does that. I mean, he is a dynamic communicator, right? So he spells and he types autonomously, and he's also doing some speaking. And neither of them are better than the other.
Yeah.
It's just fabulous that he's able to communicate now.
And if we can just offer other people the patience necessary to allow them to communicate in the ways that they are able to communicate, this prejudice that exists in our world, it wouldn't exist. So often we equate the way somebody communicates with intelligence, like you said, and the two have nothing to do with each other.
We're seeing what happens when people do get that access to communication with AAC, and they're like, oh, oops.
Yeah. Well, just like with your son, and to no fault of your own, but he gets his device and you realize, oh, he does know his shapes and his colors. I didn't realize he understood all of these things. And partly because of his apraxia, he couldn't communicate to you that he knew all of that already. But he gets that device, and suddenly you realize he knows so much more than you knew that he knew. So again, presumed competence.
This is a really great book for any parents or teachers that are supporting non-speakers or minimally speaking people, leaders around me. It's an anthology, and it's written by all people who either type or spell, use AAC to communicate. And it's amazing, and you'll learn so much. You'll gain so much perspective from learning their stories.
Right. That's a perfect segue. So why don't we move in that direction? So there's two things I want to ask you about as we kind of bring this conversation to its close. One is the book club that you run, and I want you to explain what it is and how it works. And my favorite thing about it is you don't actually have to read the books. So explain all of that and why that's so impactful and why that's such a meaningful part of your advocacy work. And then I want you to tell us about the book that you have coming out in a couple of weeks.
The book club is a special place for me. It's called That Awesome Book Club on Facebook, and it's a Facebook group. And I started it like 3 years ago because I wanted to read Neurotribes.
Real fast, explain the spelling difference because that's important.
Yeah, so it's That Awesome, which is AU-SOME book club, That Awesome Book Club. And I started it because I wanted to get through this book. It's called Neurotribes by Steve Silverman, and it's that big. And I'm not a good reader. I can read, but I'm not good at retaining. Like, I have ADHD. It's just hard for me to get through a book. So I just started it, and I was like, does anybody want to read this book with me? I'm about to start it in a couple of weeks. I'm going to make a group so we can like kind of hold each other accountable and maybe talk about it or whatever. Before we started Neurotribes, before we started reading, we had 600 members.
Wow.
600 people all wanted to read that book. That's all I said was, I want to read Neurotribes. Anybody want to read it with me? Bam, 600 people.
That's amazing.
I was like, okay, sit up straight, Megan.
Yeah.
Okay, now what? Like, and by the time we were done with it, we had over 1,000 people.
Wow.
And we read a couple more books, and then people just have other things to do, right? It just wasn't the same thing. Like we did Neurotribes all the way through. We took 3 months to do it. But then after that, it kind of, the participation faded. And so I was like, okay, well, we have all these people here. What are we going to do with it? And so we ended up making book recommendation lists.
Cool.
Instead of reading and having required reading and having to keep up with discussions and things, what we do is we just talk about books that people are reading. Awesome. Or people ask questions about, do you know a good book for this? Do you know a good book for that? And so we ended up putting out several book recommendation lists over the years. I mean, they didn't all come out at once. They're always being updated of just books that are respectful of autistic people, right? And not pathologizing, books that are written by autistic people, right?
Right.
And those are the most important books that we should be reading as parents because they have been there. They've been where our kids are. So yeah, that's what the book club is. It's really it's a place to discuss books, ask questions, find resources, and then we ended up starting interviewing the authors. So I asked Steve Silverman if you would come and talk to us because we were reading his book, and he said yes.
Awesome.
We were reading Uniquely Human by Barry Prison. I reached out to him, and he said yes. And I was like, oh my gosh, I don't know
Awesome.
how to interview anybody.
Right, right.
What? Okay. We have interviewed dozens of autistic authors, autistic advocates, authors that are not autistic but are very respectful of the autistic community, Mona De La Hook, lots of different people, and it's been really fantastic.
I love it. And so you sent me some links, so I'll make sure to include those in the show notes so people that watch this interview can go to the description on YouTube
Yeah, for sure.
and be able to have access to that. So in the time that we have left, tell us about your book that you have coming out, what it's called, why you wrote it, and why it matters so much to you.
The title of our book is called I Will Die on This Hill. And the subtitle is Autistic Adults, Autism Parents, and the Children who Deserve a Better World. That's a long title, but they had us. And it is basically a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
It is me and my co-author, who is Jules Edwards, and you can find her at Autistic Typing on social media. And she's an autistic advocate and a mother of autistic kids. She's also Indigenous. Her kids are Afro-Indigenous, I believe. And then we had several other contributors. We have about 12 people in the book from all over, right? Like I think we have 3 AAC users contributing. We have Black autistic women. We have Black autistic transgender. I mean, we have everybody. We have we try to make it very inclusive of everybody so that it's a book of perspective sharing.
Mm-hmm.
So that basically we see online a lot of tension between autistic adults and parents of autistic kids. There is a tension, right? And it's because of the trauma that autistic adults have had to face all of their lives, and that trauma is real. And so they don't want the parent's child, right, to face that, and they want to help teach the parents, and share their own perspectives. And sometimes, it just gets lost in the muddle, and social media is kind of yikes anyway. So there's power dynamics that happen, and we just wanted to kind of open the air and like just share our perspectives, because that's one thing that we're always lacking when we're on the internet and we're talking about autism. The autistic adult that doesn't have any kids doesn't really know what it is to parent and have that weight, and to have those decisions, and managing the bills and the household and everything that it comes with it. Mm-hmm. And the parent who is not autistic doesn't know what it's like to be autistic.
Yeah.
So it's really a bridge building type of book. And it opens up a lot of the things that it talks about, big organizations and how they've contributed to misinformation. It talks about so many things. We want to start conversations with the book, and that's what it is.
I love that. And it's, like the autism community or even the broader disability community, we don't exist in isolation. I love that your book is bringing in the intersectionality between marginalized communities, and not only giving perspective from parents of children with autism and adults with autism, but those who are part of other marginalized communities, and how that impacts a person's experience when you're part of more than one marginalized. It's not 3 plus 3, it's 3 times 3. It's
exponential.
Exponential how much somebody is impacted when they fall under several umbrellas of marginalized communities, and just the empathy that we all need to develop for other people, and make the assumption that when someone says, certain things about their own experiences, that they are telling the truth, that they're being honest about what they've been through, and that their experiences and their feelings matter, even if they don't directly, uh, impact other people or even the mass majority of people, right? Like we need to assume that people are telling the truth about their own experiences and meet
And
them.
assume that people are coming from a genuine place as well. I mean, and that and also remember that two things can be true at once, right? Like there's not a lot of that binary right and wrong, because there is so much intersectionality, there's so much dynamic to every decision we're making. There's lots of things to consider. So understanding that people are generally coming from a place of wanting to do what's best, right? And we have communication differences, because autistic people, that's part of the diagnosis, is that there's a communication difference.
Yep.
And so recognizing that it's not always on them. You don't want it to be on your kid to bridge that communication gap. It's on all of us to kind of meet in the middle and ask other people what they need, and just come from more of a place of openness than
Other ones.
open.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I truly believe that empathy is what's going to heal our world. If anything has the ability to heal our world, it is empathy.
Yeah.
Believing other people's experiences. Meghan, I loved this conversation, and I'm so grateful that you came on Warrior Stories. Is there anything else that you would like to share before we close in the last 3 minutes?
No, I don't think so. I think that this was a fab conversation. Thank you for doing this and inviting me. If you go to my website, I have lots of resources up there for parents and educators. They're not, most of what I talk about and the resources I share, they're not from me, right? Like everything that I talk about, I'm learning from the autistic community. So I don't want to ever think like Meghan is an expert. I'm not. I'm just sharing things that I've learned in hopes that other parents will learn things faster than I did.
Yeah. And you are a great resource to other parents. And that's kind of, it sounds to me like that is the impetus for the advocacy that you do. Like that's your niche, is learning what you can and sharing it with other people, so people can come to your websites and your book club and so forth, and your blog, to gain resources that you didn't have when you were starting out on this journey.
The resources I wish I had. Absolutely.
Yep. Awesome. Well, thank you, Meghan, for coming on Warrior Stories.
Thank you for having me.
We will keep in touch. I'm so grateful for the connection that we have, that even though we hadn't chatted for a while, once we reconnected, it was like, oh, there's my friend. I haven't seen you in a while, but
yeah, for sure.
None of that is lost. So, all right. Thank you, Meghan. We'll talk to you later. Bye.